Secretary General, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Is it good times ahead? Are we actually looking at the end of this terrible pandemic?
2021 is going to be a difficult year. We are, of course, with hope with the vaccines, hope for the first time in a long time. And this is making a whole difference. But the production and distribution in sufficient amounts of the vaccines is going to take a while. We are assuming that it's going to take most of 2021. And the last economic outlook that we produced only on the 1st of December, we called it turning hope into reality. This is because we acknowledge that there is hope, but at the same time, what we're doing is to saying we're going to have to work for it. It's not going to happen by itself. It's not going to suddenly start, with greater growth and the jobs being recovered, etc. We're still going to have to wash our hands and distance ourselves and avoid agglomerations, avoid big meetings, etc. We're also going to be, for the better part of the year, we're going to have to be teleworking as a very clear option. So as I said, it's the year of transition. I think that there is every reason to be hopeful, but at the same time, as I said, let's work on it. And also let's work on an assumption that from the time that it would take from here to the time when, let's say, substantially all the population that needs it is going to be vaccinated, it's going to take most of next year.
But does that mean that 2022 is then going to be the year that we're going to see us come back to a pre-COVID situation? I think people want to hear something hopeful.
Actually, yes. It's in some countries, a relatively small group of countries, at the end of 2021, we will be over the top of the end of 2019. In some cases, it's going to take to sometime in 2022. You're absolutely right. This means that we would have lost in terms of growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of the fight against poverty. We would have lost 2 years, which is massive. It'll be 2020 and then 2021, even with the vaccine. It just shows you how destructive and how just terrible the damage has been.
Who's got it right and who's got it wrong?
I think that the experience is mosaic, really. You have all sorts of experiences. But, for example, the very well-known case of Sweden, which did not go into the hard lockdowns. But at the same time, you had a number of countries that seemed to have gotten it right in Europe, including the countries in Eastern Europe, for example, Czech Republic.
They did mass
for example,
testing.
Poland, etc. They had very low numbers in the first wave. And then suddenly in the second wave, they have been some of the hardest hit. So it's difficult to say that there is a rule or very clear rules about this. At the same time, I would say that there continues to be a very simple notion that the question of choosing between lives and livelihoods is a false dilemma. That is not the case. One should always go for beating the virus, killing the virus, reducing the virus. We have to win the war against the virus. If we do that faster, if we do that more efficiently, if we do that in a way in which will make all the resources work for that purpose, then what happens is that there will be economic and social consequences that are positive. That means, or at least will be less expensive, will be less difficult, will have less scarring.
Secretary General, the OECD was created after World War II in order to rebuild Europe, to have the funds that came out of the United States, the Marshall Plan, to rebuild Europe. And that was a very idealistic, visionary thing. And some would argue it actually did work. It rebuilt Europe fantastically in so many ways. But that was a situation where the US was in pretty good shape. We are not going to have that kind of same impetus this time, are we?
Listen, to put it in context, I think the Marshall Plan channeled about 13 billion of those days, which has probably got maybe 130 billion these days, maybe 10 times more. Do you know how much money the countries have thrown at the COVID-19 phenomenon? Well, about maybe 100 times that. So you're talking about 100 Marshall Plans. You're talking about mostly individual decisions in the US, in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Japan, in Korea, etc., to provide central banks liquidity to the commercial banks, then the government some guarantees to create an incentive for the commercial banks to lend or to roll over the loans so that the SMEs can continue to survive and large companies can continue operating. And at the same time, the support from governments to the unemployed. But let me just say that in terms of the size of the effort, right now it's many, many times bigger in comparison, not only to the Marshall Plan, but also even to the amounts of resources that were injected in the world economy in 2008, 2009, only 10 or 12 years ago.
How much do you think, though, that this has been effective? If you were to give a global rating on the stimulus packages, how effective do you think that they have been on a scale of 1 to 10? Have they really served what they were supposed to, and that is to reach the poorest?
They worked in two different ways. One is that they kept the economy going. They kept consumption going. They kept people with revenues, with income, with capacity to buy their food, with capacity to continue to have a revenue. They kept many of the SMEs by paying the workforce and by giving them some flexibility on the working capital. Also, in many of the mechanisms or of the platforms, you actually had loans that could turn into equity, that could turn into capital to stabilize the situation. All that was very important and was very big in terms of the size. But also, please think when you're talking about debt to GDP ratio, it's a ratio. Therefore, the GDP counts just as much. And what happens is that GDP dropped, GDP fell in 2020 by 4.5%, 5% for the world. In some cases in Europe, 8 or 9%. Some countries fell even more, but they would have fallen by double that if the countries had not injected these resources. So I think in that sense, the first wave of support in answer to the first wave of the virus was effective. Now it has to be much more targeted because some of the countries have run out of ammunition.
Do we need to worry about the fact that we're creating so much debt now with these stimulus packages that is going to haunt our children in decades to come? Or should we just not worry about that at all?
Not the time to be looking at the debt issue right now. Right now, hit the virus, kill the virus, beat the virus. That is a battle we have to play. That is the priority. Then we will have to worry about other things. Remember, interest rates are very, very low. You actually have 10-year bonds in some European countries with negative. And China just issued a negative interest rate bond. So you see that you have a situation which is completely new, and therefore perhaps the cost of adding some more debt in order to beat the virus is worth it.
What about the largest economy in the world still, and that is the United States? Are you more optimistic about how the United States is going to perform? They seem to be doing very badly on the health front.
We believe that the United States is going to have a strong rebound in 2021. But I think it is fair to say that we are still having much larger numbers of infections and much larger numbers of hospitalization. Today, as we speak, we have a problem of capacity in many of the hospitals in many of the cities in the United States. And then, of course, the number of deaths that have increased. Therefore, in the case of the United States, it's going to be very important to see the curve, the momentum with which we enter into the new year. Because also in the United States is a place where the deployment of vaccines is more advanced, at least in the countries in the OECD.
What do you think of President-elect Biden's suggestion of 100 days of mask wearing when he comes in? Do you think that that's a good suggestion?
I think it is an excellent suggestion. I think if that had been done, 100 days ago, we would be in much better shape. And if it had been done 180 days ago,
So the Trump administration should have done this.
That applies for every single country in the world, by the way. Many countries, the question of the mask is still not mandatory. But I remember in the beginning of the problem, we were still discussing whether masks were useful or not. Then we came to the conclusion by, May, June, that yes, they were very important. But still, in many countries, including in mine, in Mexico, we did not ask the people to all wear the masks. And then people took some time before becoming aware. There's a question of awareness here. And then therefore, the question of communication is just as important as the question of the discovery of the vaccines and the application of the vaccines, because it depends a lot on what people do. In the end, it's about the discipline of people as a group, as a collective. If they react positively, then we can beat the virus faster.
Isn't it also because that we as the world don't actually seem to have that group belief anymore? We don't have a group belief in the international organizations. There seems to be a fair amount of distrust from everything from the WHO to the IMF to the WTO or even the OECD.
I think that the problem is not as simple. The problem has to do with leadership in the different countries individually. And the problem also has to do with whether the leaders have put themselves in the hands of science. Those leaders that put themselves in the hands of science and that were recommending to the population what the scientists were recommending have done better.
If we look at Asia, how do you think Asia is going to come out of this? If we say Asia will have, of course, China, to some degree pulling the whole of the region forward. But on the other hand, some economists are saying that China is going to end up becoming more inward looking. They're going to want to try and secure themselves, their own domestic market. So the pandemic has made all of us more protectionist.
I think protection is precisely the wrong answer. If anything, remember, please, we already had a bad situation before the COVID because we had trade tensions, and not just between China and the United States, it was also between the United States and Europe. But since then, what has happened is that there have been a number of decisions to consolidate, for example, create these, like the reset, for example, which happened only a few days ago. That was very good news because it means you're moving in the right direction from the time of trade tensions, which were creating investment problems, which were creating uncertainty, and therefore were creating a slowdown in the world economy before the COVID struck. This pandemic is the most global phenomenon we have ever faced in our lifetimes. It needs a global approach to beat it.
But that's what we don't have, Secretary General.
But this one is really, really pan. In the pandemic, the word pan, that means it's all over the place. Not a single country has been spared. And therefore, the only solution is global, except we were in the time before, we were having problems of too much national focus, but maybe less international cooperation. Now, I'm not talking about something about pandemic, about COVID. I'm talking about trade, okay? But all I'm saying is this happened during the pandemic, which was good news. So the idea here is for the pandemic, to beat the pandemic faster. International cooperation between countries is crucial. And second, remember, this must be a global public good. Vaccines are a global public good. So I remember one Singaporean, the finance minister of Singapore, who said vaccines should be for some of the people in all of the countries, rather than for all of the people in some of the countries. I think this is the way to look at it, at least in the early stages.
Who are you most hopeful about, Secretary General? Which countries do you say, apart from China? You say China's going to lead. Other than that,
I don't want to belabor this again and again, but there are few, and I would say China stands out simply because of the numbers. You know, it's a very large number that is going to be positive because it paid its dues. China paid its price very early in the game. And therefore, there is a certain delay that the other countries, they came in later, 2-3 months later, and then they have a lag in terms of the way they're coming out of the pandemic itself, but also of the recovery in terms of the economy.
Will you take the vaccine, sir, when it becomes available to you?
Absolutely. 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 I would be delighted. My wife would be delighted. You know, she's a doctor. My daughter is a doctor. My son-in-law is a doctor. And I very strongly believe in science and in what science is recommending to us. Absolutely. I would take it. And I would be on the record, and I would be on the TV if they want me, you know, to show that absolutely we believe in this, that this is the way.
Secretary General, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you so much. I wish you all the best. Stay safe.